to address this overgrowing concern that's affecting not just the G20 member states, but also LDCs, SEDs, and LLDCs. The G20 countries have large exposure risk from asset concentrations and vulnerability to disasters. But that's not just the issue of G20 member states. If we look into SEDs and LDCs, this is equally an issue that needs to be addressed from a perspective of a whole of society approach. There are certain countries where there is just one airport, which is a critical asset that needs to be addressed and looked at from a systems perspective. There are countries where we are seeing heat waves and urban flooding is creating far too much exposure to the most critical assets that are currently in place and that needs to be put in place in the future to go. In last year, also during the presidency of India, apart from the working groups, deliberations, and the outcome document, the UN General Assembly, under the leadership of Poland, also adopted a General Assembly resolution that has to do with transboundary resilience of critical infrastructure. And the reason I'm mentioning this here is that a lot of infrastructure that needs to be looked into from a resilience perspective and development perspective are also not within just the boundary and assets of a country. They are also cross-cutting, going into other countries, regions, and boundaries, in particularly water, transport, and aviation to take place. Now, today's side event, jointly organized with the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure and with the presidency of Brazil, is going to look into some of these issues from the perspective of member states on where do they see some of the bottlenecks in addressing challenges, but what are some of the opportunities going forward as we approach gradually towards the towards the 2030 paradigm of itself. The political declaration and the midterm review of the Sendai framework have equally put a greater emphasis on this, and amongst other on the financing issue that needs to be addressed together hand in hand. So without further ado, I will now call in a video message from SRSG, Mr. Kamal Kishore, who he could not join us today in person or virtually with us. So he has kindly provided a video message that we would like to share with you. Sarah, could you please?
Yeah.
Thank you, Omar.
I'm very happy that in the margins of G20 working group deliberations, this side event on disaster and climate resilient infrastructure is being organized. First of all, I would like to express my sympathies, my condolences for all the loss of lives, all the loss of livelihoods and property that has taken place in Brazil this year because of unprecedented floods. This is yet another reminder of how important it is to invest in our resilience, in our societal resilience, and building disaster and climate resilient infrastructure is a cornerstone of that. It is really important that the infrastructure investments we make today are able to withstand shocks not just today, but also into the future in coming decades, not just 1 or 2 decades, but multiple decades. And the way risks are panning out globally, the way climate change is creating new patterns of risk, not just increasing the intensity and frequency of extreme weather events, but also changing their geography. It is really important that we find ways to continually stress test our infrastructure systems for these emerging scenarios. It is really important that we bring to bear the best possible science, the best possible evidence, scientific evidence, to look at what our infrastructure is likely to be exposed to. The way we imagine infrastructure has to bring together both gray and green infrastructure. We have to make sure that we have enough redundancies in our critical infrastructure systems so that when failures occur, the failures are not just the infrastructure systems are not just fail-safe, but they are also safe to fail. When they fail, the impacts are not catastrophic. It is really important. It is also important that when we imagine futures infrastructure, we look at not just asset creation, but also look at what are the services we are trying to deliver. Really, form must follow function. We have to promise to our people not just more infrastructure assets, but more reliable, out into the future, continued resilient infrastructure services. That's what we should be aiming for. In this regard, one of the concerns I want to bring in front of the working group here is that reporting against Target D of the Sendai framework is not very good. In fact, of all the 7 targets that we have in Sendai framework, Target D, which deals with critical infrastructure, our reporting is the weakest. So can we put our heads together to determine what would it take for countries to report more on how we are doing on resilience of critical infrastructure systems? When we have better evidence, we have better decisions. It's really important that we improve this. There are so many other things that I would like to discuss with you about making risk information more democratic, more easily accessible, much better sharing of standards, standard setting practices, regulation of professions involved in financing, as well as building infrastructure, having mechanisms to restore infrastructure when it does get disrupted, and of course, the whole thing of making sure that there is an attractive proposition for financiers to put money into resilience of infrastructure systems. I wish you all the very best, and I'm very much looking forward to what is the outcome of your deliberations, how G20 will advance the cause of disaster and climate resilient infrastructure, and how my organization, United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, can partner with you in taking this agenda forward in order to build resilience not just for ourselves, but also for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, also, Tomar. I would now like to invite Mr. Paulo Falcao, the director of SEDEC. We could not have the opportunity to have the Secretary World today with us due to the ongoing response situation in Brazil. But Paulo, the virtual floor is all yours.
Bom dia a todos. É com grande honra que participo da abertura desse evento sobre infraestrutura resiliente, representando o nosso secretário Wolf. Como falado, meu nome é Paulo Falcão, eu sou secretário nacional de Proteção e Defesa Civil substituto. Antes de dar início, gostaria de expressar os sinceros agradecimentos pelas mensagens de solidariedade e apoio que temos recebido no Brasil diante do desastre ocorrido no estado do Rio Grande do Sul. Infelizmente, as enchentes e deslizamentos de terra resultaram em perdas significativas de vidas e danos extensivos à infraestrutura. Essa tragédia nos lembra de forma dolorosa a importância vital em termos de infraestruturas resilientes. Fica claro que precisamos construir sistemas que não apenas resistam aos desastres naturais, mas que também se recuperem rapidamente, minimizando os impactos sobre nossas comunidades. Nesse sentido, a resiliência das infraestruturas é um conceito que transcende a mera robustez estrutural. Trata-se de construir sistemas que não apenas resistam aos impactos físicos, mas que também têm uma capacidade de adaptação e recuperação rápida e eficiente após eventos adversos. Além disso, entendemos que é fundamental que o conceito de infraestrutura resiliente seja premissa para a implantação de novas infraestruturas planejadas. Esse deve ser o novo padrão, assegurando que nossas comunidades estejam melhor preparadas para enfrentar as adversidades climáticas e outros desafios. Em momentos de crise como este, do desastre do Rio Grande do Sul, nós observamos de forma clara que as populações mais vulneráveis são as que mais sofrem com os impactos dos desastres. Essas comunidades frequentemente carecem de recursos suficientes para se proteger e se recuperar. Portanto, fortalecer nossas infraestruturas significa também criar condições para que essas populações possam resistir melhor às adversidades, reduzindo a desigualdade social que se agrava em tempos de crise. A inclusão social é, portanto, um componente integral para viabilizar a construção de infraestruturas resilientes. Ao desenvolver projetos de infraestrutura que considerem as necessidades das comunidades mais vulneráveis, estamos promovendo uma sociedade mais justa e equitativa. Isso implica em garantir que todos, independente de suas condições socioeconômicas, tenham acesso a sistemas de proteção e suporte eficazes. A resiliência das infraestruturas deve ser vista como um catalisador para a equidade social. Desta forma, a construção de infraestrutura resiliente não é apenas uma resposta técnica aos desafios físicos, mas também uma resposta social e moral às desigualdades estruturais que afetam nossas sociedades. Para alcançar essa resiliência inclusiva, é crucial que haja financiamento adequado e direcionado. Esses investimentos devem ser vistos não apenas como um custo, mas também como um compromisso com a segurança e o bem-estar de toda a população. Sim, garantir o financiamento para infraestruturas resilientes é um passo essencial para a criação de uma sociedade mais equitativa e preparada para desafios futuros. Finalmente, gostaria de pedir desculpas pelo cancelamento de nossa reunião virtual anterior devido às emergências enfrentadas. No entanto, reafirmo o comprometimento do Brasil com essa pauta crucial. Muito obrigado.
Thank you, Paulo, for those opening remarks. Equivocally, and I think I'm speaking on behalf of everybody today joining the call and those who are not with us. We are deeply with Brazil and everybody who's responding and has been affected during because of the floods there. And we hope that the conversation today, but also the upcoming meeting of the working group, will try to answer some of these questions that have been raised not just by Brazil but by other member states around resilient recovery and the role of infrastructure resilience. But I won't keep this conversation further with me. I will now pass the floor to my colleague and friend, Mr. Amit Pruthi from the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, to take us forward with the conversation. Thank you, and off to you, Amit.
Thank you so much, Abhilash, and thank you for the G20 presidency and UNDRR for organizing this session with us and inviting us to lead a conversation that, even in the comments so far that we've heard, is only getting more and more important. We have a really impressive panel with us today. I'm going to introduce the panelists. I'll also start with setting a context for why we are having this conversation, just to get something started, and then turn it over to the panelists. I will start asking some specific questions to the panelists. And we have a lot of people. I think I'm counting about 125 participants. So we would also welcome questions. If you have questions, I would suggest start posting them in the chat group, and I promise you I'll get them. We've got a team of people here to support us, so that we actually have a dialogue and it's not just a one-sided discussion. With that, let me first introduce the panelists that we have. We have Ms. Louise Rousseau from France. She's from the French Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs. She's the head of the unit in charge of disaster risk reduction and climate finance, among other issues. She has previously worked at the Embassy of France in India as a policy officer on urban development and energy. Welcome, Luisa, and good to see you again. We have Ms. Chiara Carzacci, who's a senior expert in DRR and the Italian government's national focal point for the Sendai framework on DRR. Since 2000, she has been working as a technical scientific expert at the Italian Civil Protection Department. She has experience in the field of prevention, preparedness, emergency response, and disaster risk reduction. Since 2021, she has been the national focal point on the Sendai framework. Ciao, Chiara. It's good to see you again. We have Dr. Krishna Vatsa from India. Dr. Vats has worked in the area of disaster risk reduction and recovery for the last 25 years. Prior to joining as the member for the National Disaster Management Authority, Dr. Vats worked as policy advisor in UNDP in New York and Nairobi during 2015 to 2020, and as regional disaster reduction advisor in South and Southwest Asia in New Delhi from 2008 to 2014. Dr. Watts has a doctorate in science in disaster risk management from the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and has published extensively on the subject. Good to see you again, Dr. Watts. You and I were on a flight that got delayed because of storms. So as we are talking about the issue of disruption to services because of climate, Dr. Watts and I literally had to do an overnight stay in a different city because our flight got canceled because of a storm in Delhi. So it's a live lived experience that we share. Welcome to Mr. Umetsu Togo from Japan. After graduating from Tohoku University in 2019, he joined a major Japanese construction company with expertise in disaster risk reduction technologies and disaster resilient infrastructure development. He is from Sendai City and experienced the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake. With these backgrounds, he joined the Disaster Management Bureau Cabinet Office in 2024, where he is in charge of multilateral and bilateral cooperation, as well as promotion of disaster risk reduction technologies. Welcome, Mr. Togo. I also want to welcome Ms. Robin Keegan, Acting Associate Administrator for Resilience at the Federal Emergency Management Agency from the US. Ms. Keegan is a policy thought leader and practitioner and has most recently served as the Senior Advisor for Economic Recovery and Resilience and Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Development at the US Department of Housing and Urban Development. In addition, Ms. Keegan established a new office to oversee and manage implementation of a grant of more than $4.5 billion for housing, economic development, resilience, infrastructure, and community services. Welcome, Ms. Keegan. And it must be really early for you, actually, really early for people in Brazil and the Americas. So early good morning to all of you. My last speaker is Mr. Oscar Guerra, Chief Executive of the Climate and Environmental Action Division at CAF. Oscar is an executive principal of the Climate Change Unit, Vice Presidency of Sustainable Development at the Latin American Development Bank. In his role, he is CAF's focal point into the GCF, currently overseeing and supporting CAF's portfolio of projects and accreditation standards with the GCF. He has more than 18 years of experience in the climate agenda, nature conservation, sustainable development, and humanitarian aid, adaptation, and resilience. Welcome, Oscar, to you as well. So I will start quickly and just set the context with a presentation. I promise you I won't stay too long with this, but it's really to get our food for thought. And then after that, I'll start asking some pointed questions to our panelists. So first of all, CDRI, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, has been set up purely to think about capacity building and technical assistance to focus on the agenda of DRI. We are really glad today that, and if you allow me my technology, if it works, then I'm, next slide. We're very happy that the Brazil presidency has taken forward the agenda of resilient infrastructure that was started last year. The importance of this agenda is only getting, the agenda is only getting more and more important. Next slide. Brazil just talked about what's going on in Brazil, flooding, landslides. We saw what happened in Papua New Guinea. If you start thinking about disasters and you start thinking about the link to infrastructure, again and again and again, we find examples where infrastructure has failed to provide the services for which it is being designed. Here's an example from Hurricane Irma and Maria in Puerto Rico in 2017. So, now 7 years ago, where a Category 4 storm followed by a Category 5 storm struck the island of Puerto Rico and damaged much of the electrical grid infrastructure to the extent that for close to a year, people were not able to have power. Next slide. Similarly, we have the example of Bangkok, where a flood in 2011 significantly disrupted supply chains around the world. And, I happened to be living in the US at that time. And I remember I was trying to order a computer And I wasn't able to get it because Western Digital hard drives were not available and things were backed up for 3, 4, 5 months. So, when we think about infrastructure, of course, it's lives and livelihoods of people. It's also our supply chains that are heavily reliant on infrastructure systems. Next slide. UNDRR's own research is showing that, our number of disasters are not going down by any, are not going down. They really they continue to go up. And like the significant proportion of disasters today are linked to hydromet related risks. For example, floods, for example, storms. We're seeing that more and more and more, and we're seeing those disasters actually more contributing more when you start looking at the whole, the kinds of disasters that we're experiencing. And I would start to add today that, even extreme heat may maybe something that we need to add to this list. Next slide. Now, when we think about infrastructure, there is an economic cost of infrastructure. As we are building infrastructure, we're also losing infrastructure. Considerable portion of larger infrastructure is insured. And if you look at the insurance industry, they're reporting increased losses for the past several decades. Of course, now we're seeing much more in terms of the economic losses. In 2021, the economic losses were 259 billion. 2022, I can guarantee you it was larger. I don't have the numbers, but if somebody can find out, we'll see that those numbers are larger. That's the insured losses. There's also a lot of losses that are happening in households, in firms that may or may not be insured. And those numbers are also increasing. The World Bank's Lifelines report itself, which was now 5 years old, reported that at least $390 billion a year was lost because of disruptions for low and medium income countries, for small households, businesses, and communities. So, we are actually already experiencing losses when we can measure them and sometimes not measure them, but we're actually seeing the volume of losses going up. Next slide. So why should we focus on resilient infrastructure? One, of course, we need to reduce losses. We can't afford to continue to build and lose. That's not a good equation for us. At the same time, there's a considerable amount of infrastructure that is yet to be built. And when we look at how we are building infrastructure and we link that to our climate mitigation agendas, we realize that infrastructure is actually contributing close to 80% of GHG gas emissions around the world. So, on one end, we're trying to address mitigation. On the other end, we're building infrastructure that is actually contributing to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. And we need to change that. Second part of this is we are still trying to meet the SDGs by 2030. And when you think about the SDG goals, infrastructure cuts across 17 of the goals that we've all promised to reach by 2030. So, we do need to continue to think about infrastructure in a new way. And the opportunity right now is that the amount of infrastructure we have built in the last 200 years is actually going to be built in the next 20, 30 years. So the scale of infrastructure that is actually yet to be built is incredible and massive. And already there is evidence that shows that if you invest in resilience, you can actually accrue multiple benefits on what you're investing. Kamal Kishore, the SRSG, talked about how countries are also quite behind in meeting the target D reporting. We've all agreed to meet the Sendai framework, and infrastructure resilience is actually lagging behind where we are. So there's a really important case to think about resilient infrastructure. So CDRI, our mandate is to focus purely on infrastructure resilience. Came out with a report last year that looked at infrastructure in the risks in the infrastructure sectors. So we looked across 8 infrastructure sectors and looked at 6 hazards globally. This is a publicly available data. It's using some of the best probabilistic risk modeling to understand how exposed is our infrastructure today. And we find that, a considerable portion of our infrastructure, and looking at the different infrastructure types, is exposed to various hazards. And this includes climate, but this also includes natural hazards like earthquakes, landslides, etc. And when you look at which sectors are more exposed, we find that roads and railways are actually are exposed considerably more. The proportion of exposure is considerably more in the roads and railways sector. Doesn't mean the others are not important, but just to understand proportionality, we realize that certain sectors are carrying more risk than others. We also looked at what is the vulnerability of the exposed, how vulnerable are the exposed assets? And we find that, globally, we are carrying something like $300 to $330 billion of risk of what we can lose in a given year because of infrastructure losses. And this is just looking at assets. This is not looking at you lose an asset and the disruption. So our report is purely focused on what is the risk to infrastructure assets, which sectors are more at risk, how much risk are we carrying, and where is that risk geographically located? So, we built a probabilistic model to understand that. Next slide. We also find, and again, for most of you, this may not be new information, but infrastructure is concentrated more in high-income countries and less in lower LMICs and middle-income countries. The value of infrastructure, the amount of infrastructure per capita, is much higher in more upper-income countries compared to lower-income countries. When you look at investments from the private sector, we also find that about 80% of private sector investment is going to high-income countries versus LMICs. We also look at risk, and you realize that the proportion of infrastructure at risk is much greater in lower income countries compared to higher income countries. So, the Brazilian chair talked about equity, talked about, we have to make sure that the most vulnerable are the ones we are supporting. And when you look at global numbers in terms of where investments are going, where infrastructure is concentrating, we find that lower income countries have lower share of the infrastructure, higher risk, and higher vulnerability. And we need to think more carefully of what can we collectively, from the industry, but also from G20 countries, how do you change that? Next slide. We also realize that as we are building, we are actually adding to systemic risk. So, if you're coming from an urban development background, you will probably realize that the way we've been building our cities is also contributing to increased flood risk. So, while climate change is definitely adding to the risk profile, the way we are building is also not helping us. So our own development practices are actually contributing to growing systemic risks. Next slide. So when you think about resilient infrastructure, what are the various ways to start to bring this notion of resilience into our infrastructure development? And we've looked at it from 5 dimensions. So that's really going to be the conversation today, is the 5 dimensions at least. And there are more, I'm not, but at least these 5 can help to think about resilience more from, these are the dimensions that will help us build resilience infrastructure. The first one is much more, investment towards risk assessment. I think as we are building our infrastructure, we do need to have a better understanding of where the risks are, so that when we are investing in building, rebuilding, are we contributing to our risks, or are we actually addressing those risks? So having a much more nuanced understanding of risk will help all of us. Countries are doing this. I think we want to make sure that the methodologies that you're using, how you're bringing risk assessment into your policy frameworks, it'll be great to get G20 to come out with, this is how we're doing risk assessments. This is how some things have worked, haven't worked. This is how we're using technology, etc. So I think focusing on risk assessment will be very helpful. CDRI last year launched a publicly available risk assessment database. This is available online for all of the countries. So, it's a great starting point, at least, to get some kind of uniformity if that is needed. Next slide. Second aspect of this is governance. We really need to pay more attention to enhanced planning and design standards, codes, regulations, to ensure that we are building quality and reliable infrastructure. Again, countries are doing this. Some countries are doing it much better than others. Can we share what is working, what is not working? Linked to this is compliance. Linked to this is operations and maintenance. Linked to governance is deep stakeholder engagement, so that we're actually understanding the systems level thinking that is required in our decision making. So the second dimension really is on infrastructure governance. Next slide. The third dimension clearly is financing for resilience. There is an estimated $106 trillion of untapped private institutional capital worldwide. Private sector capital is not going to go towards addressing risks unless that capital has, found a way to minimize risk to returns. So we need to think about how can we bring in a more nuanced layer of translating risk information in a way where risk reduction can then attract more financing for resilience. There's aspects of resilience dividend. We in our report look at, if you bring in avoided costs, an understanding of avoided costs upfront, will that be an incentive to build resilient infrastructure? Similarly, a lot of our domestic capital is going towards low carbon and climate resilient pathways. How are we doing it? How are we linking finance to resilience? I think that's an important discussion as well. Next slide. Clearly, knowledge sharing and capacity building. I think the G20 countries are a leader when it comes to resilient infrastructure. Sharing your experiences, sharing your successes, also sharing where the challenges have been will be very helpful. Last year, under India's presidency, we compiled an online compendium. We are working again with UNDRR and the Brazil presidency to update that compendium. And the compendium is really starting to bring case studies from all of the G20 countries to say, this is how we're looking at resilience in our own country. So I would encourage all of you to help continue to build out the database of case studies to share amongst each others and with others beyond the G20. Next slide. The final dimension of this is, we all have an imagination of infrastructure that often is gray. We think about building storm drains, we think about building, sea walls, we think about building infrastructure in a way which now maybe parts of it needs to be rethought about. There are now more and more examples of ecosystem-based or nature-based infrastructure solutions. It'll be really helpful to start paying a lot more attention of how to continue to innovate in infrastructure using solutions such as NBS or ecosystem-based solutions that can help reduce the GHG emissions on one side, but also often these are more cost-effective. So, how do we bring those forward? Next slide. So with that, I'll stop. I think I just want to articulate these 5 dimensions that we can at least start to talk about in the context of resilient infrastructure. With that, I will start to ask questions so we can stop sharing the slides. I know it was a bit much, but I think it wanted to set up a context of at least when we're talking about resilient infrastructure, there is a certain granularity of it that we can bring through our conversation. So for my first question is to Ms. Louisa from France. Luis, actually. Luis, the G20 Quality Infrastructure Investment Principles, QII principles, provide strategic direction for raising the economic efficiency of infrastructure assets over their lifespan, while also integrating social and environmental consideration, including building resilience. The principles build on a global consensus that infrastructure is a significant driver of economic prosperity, and that well-built and sustainable infrastructure maximizes the positive impact of infrastructure investments for all. Within that context, how does France see the interlinkages between DRR and the promotion of quality infrastructure? How does France contribute to these advancements of these agendas at the international level. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And so my name is Louis Grousseau, and I want to thank the G20 presidency and also UNDR and CDRI for organizing this event and offering us this opportunity to exchange today. Well, that's a very broad but fascinating question. And infrastructure is one of the sectors that is particularly vulnerable to the physical impacts of climate change, but also to other disaster risks that may or may not be linked to climate change. So resilience considerations are becoming central in designing and also in the locational aspects of the quality infrastructures projects. And so France is really eager to contribute to advancing infrastructure and disaster risk reduction agendas on the international stage, both separately but also jointly, because the interlinkages are very important. So we are very committed to supporting ambitious and rapid actions on disaster risk reduction first. This is very well reflected through our support to UNDR, but also to CRUISE, the Climate Risks and Early Warning Systems Initiative, as well as our clear support to the call from the UN Secretary General on deploying early warning for. And we are also eager to contribute to advancing this agenda through knowledge sharing, and it was one of the points in your 5 principles. And last year, I want to remind our participants here that last year during the G20 hosted and chaired by India, in the Disaster Risk Reduction Working Group, we shared with the G20 community a study from CEREMA, the Center for Studies on Risks, the Environment, Mobility and Urban Planning, on building a resilient strategy for transport infrastructures. And we would be glad to share it again if it might be useful in this year's G20. In the different elements that you have mentioned on risk assessment, governance, etc., you have mentioned in particular also financing for resilience, and maybe we can touch a bit upon that here. So the mobilization of expertise and funding, both private and public, for strategic, high quality and sustainable infrastructures in developing countries also takes a very important part in our fight against climate change and its harmful consequences. And so climate action is the keystone of our action in developing countries, and we cannot separate the fight against climate change from the sustainable development, also in the spirit of the 2030 agenda. And also in that spirit, we are very committed to the promotion of ambitious infrastructure and quality principles and standards. And so we are very strongly advocating for the inclusion of the Principles for Quality Infrastructures Investment, QII, of the G20 head of states in 2019, as they have become a very leading reference. And I will touch upon the 4th principle of QII, because it concerns the resilience of infrastructure to natural disasters. And we believe that large recognition of QIIs could help build a solid multilateral community committed to promoting sustainable and virtuous infrastructure projects. And we also touch upon some other initiatives that we are strongly supporting and we feel are relevant for promoting the resilience and disaster risk reduction agendas. First, it's fast infra. We really want to strengthen and underline the relevance of the fast infra multi-stakeholders initiative. It has been launched under the auspices of the One Planet Summit in 2019, and it aims at supporting the implementation of the QII principles. So we believe that this initiative is really important in a way to promote our agenda here. There is also the SOURCE platform that we strongly support because it contributes to capacity building and the upstream consideration of resilience. And so we are funding the deployment of SOURCE in developing countries. And so it contributes to the community of user countries and also through a joint Franco-French-German initiative. And finally, my last point will be about the new financing pact that was adopted a year ago at the Paris Summit in June 2023. We propose to the international community the Paris Pact for the People and Planet, or 4P. This is a global transformation agenda that has been now endorsed by 56 countries, both from the north and the south, on every continent. And it aims to release additional resources for the benefit of the most vulnerable people and countries, and so that no one has to choose between the fight against poverty and climate change. And so it provides a clear roadmap that promotes greater consideration of vulnerabilities and resilience. And among others, I want to underline the work that has been undertaken on the deployment of innovative mechanisms, such as a debt servicing substantiation clauses in the event of natural disasters, CRDC, which aim to free up liquidity for the benefit of populations when it's most needed. So I will stop here, but here were some examples of how we see we can promote the disaster risk reduction and resilient infrastructures agendas together. And I want to thank you again for giving us the opportunity to share it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Louise. Thank you for start linking your comments also to those dimensions I was talking about. And if time permits, I will come back to you after I've gone through the others on linking the QII fast infra, and maybe a little bit more discussion on the role of these labels and these principles. How are they being tested, case studies, just to get a little bit more flavor of how they're being applied. Next, I will move to Chiara. Hi, Chiara. Improving governance, regulatory frameworks, and increased investment in infrastructure maintenance makes it possible to boost the resilience of infrastructure against various hazards and threats. Italy's been working a lot in that space of governance. I think my question to you is, how do we strengthen the regulatory frameworks towards infrastructure resilience with a focus on the entire life cycle of the infrastructure, including operations and maintenance? What are your key recommendations for G20 to strengthen the regulatory frameworks for building resilient infrastructure systems? Over to you, Chiara.
Thanks, Hamid. Thanks for the opportunity to speak at this G20 side event, and thanks to CDRI and UNDRR for organizing it. Let me express solidarity to the Brazilian colleagues and to the Brazilian population. Coming to your question, in this today interconnected world, the resilience of infrastructure is more critical event, especially in Italy, where we have a huge amount of cultural age. We are a industrialized country. And we is a country very prone to risk. We have every kind of risk, natural and man-made risk. So in Italy, ensuring resilience of infrastructure is not only a matter of safety, but is also a sort of preserving our cultural heritage and our identity as an industrialized country. We have an approach. I wanted to arrive to your question, spend some words about how is our key point. First of all, we think that monitoring and prevention activities are crucial. And for this, we try to develop knowledge and methods to manufacture infrastructure resilience critical area. Monitoring is meaning support with real-time observation, the early scene of degradation. And this is real for building a building, also for area.
Chiara?
Also to prevent the significant incident.
Chiara, can I stop you for a second? Or did we lose her? My apologies, everybody. I think we have, no, she's coming back. Chiara, we are having a little bit of tough time hearing you. I would suggest switch off your video, but do continue to speak. Chiara, can you hear me? Chiara, can you hear me?
Yes, I made the connection. I'm sorry.
Maybe you can switch off your video.
Could you say?
Maybe you can switch off your video and speak.
Could you hear me now?
Yes, much better. So we
Okay,
heard you
it's
talk
better
about
now?
yes,
Please.
we heard you talk about monitoring and using real-time observation. So that's where we stopped. So please continue from there.
Okay. Yes.
Please continue.
Okay. Yes. So we have we suggest to improve rapid assessment and for this we are a system for monitoring critical infrastructure thanks to agreement among entities responsible for seismic monitoring and the Minister for Infrastructure. This agreement aims to develop technological activity for monitoring and analyze physical risk of a national critical infrastructure. Data are made available to the infrastructure manager to prevent incident and damage for wear and tear. This, of course, is a part of improving governance. You asked me before about the regulatory framework of in Italy, the management of critical infrastructure has been led by a special unit under the presidency of Council of Ministers because the matter is multidisciplinary. Of course, Italy, as many countries, developed a national plan for sustainable development and plan for climate changes, as well as a strategy to reduce natural risk or target legislation for protecting critical infrastructure. However, the current situation is that various ministers have competence related to some critical infrastructure sectors. There is a lack of coherence, strategy, and coordination among the different bodies working in this specific sector. But the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union have set a new directive on the resilience of the infrastructure, which Italy is in the process to adopt. Be precise, this on the 10th of June of this year. Of course, it could be a framework in which Italy can improve the government of infrastructure. And coordinated effort, Italy plans to create a Council of Ministers, so at the high level, not under different ministers, but directly there is a way to connect efficiently in different sectors. I would like to spend some word about the funding source.
Chiara, I'm having a difficult time hearing you. Maybe what I can do is I can come back to you. I heard, the national plan. You have a lot of national planning. You are also.
Hi, Hamid. I am here again.
Okay. Should I come back to you a little bit later to see if you have a better connection?
Yes. No, I'm sorry, but I am out of Italy. I'm in Albania, and the connection, it is the best connection that I could have. I'm very, very sorry, but because the Italian mobile doesn't work, so this is the connection of the hotel, and I know that is very bad, but I have not alternative. May I conclude with some information about funding? Because Italy very enriched. Please, Amit.
Yeah, I think, Chiara, maybe if you want to add some comments in the chat, that may be helpful as well.
Okay.
Yeah. Because it's a bit difficult, Chiara. So I think if you can add some comments in the chat as we are speaking, that would be helpful as well. So if you don't mind, I will then go on to the next person.
Okay.
Grazie, Chiara. I'm going to move to Dr. Watts. I think Dr. Watts, just maybe picking up also from what we heard from Italy on monitoring, but also on the whole notion of governance. I think, clearly infrastructure plays a critical role in building social and economic resilience of communities. This also requires strong local governance systems. So from your perspective, how do we strengthen local government systems for building resilience of infrastructure and ensure non-disruption of services after any disaster? What would be some of the key recommendations for G20 to strengthen the local level governance and local capacities for building resilient infrastructure systems? Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Abhilash. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Excellent. Thank you. So I'm from the National Disaster Management Authority, and we are in the business of disaster risk management. We are not really in the business of infrastructure building. Yet, we engaged in infrastructure building on a large scale because, what you mentioned, economic and social resilience, it's also infrastructure is not just about economic and social resilience, it's also about physical resilience. And that is why we engaged in infrastructure building on a large scale. We implemented 2 phases of the National Cyclone Risk Mitigation Program. And both the phases were funded by the World Bank. And under this program, we built a large number of roads and bridges in the coastal states of India. And we built these roads and bridges largely to protect the population in the coastal areas. So when they are exposed to the cyclones, they would be able to leave the coastal areas and move to safer areas. So it's a huge investment, and that has really paid dividends in terms of reducing mortality and the losses. Now people are able to leave these places, and the government is much better in a much better position to evacuate large number of people, thanks to the presence of the infrastructure. While we have invested so much in infrastructure building, we also need to take care of these infrastructure assets on a long-term basis. And that's a big challenge. Because most of this infrastructure actually lie with the local governments. They are responsible for maintaining them. So there are several issues that come up when the local governments are entrusted with the maintenance of the infrastructure assets. And you cannot always blame them, because the local governments are always constrained for resources, both the technical resources and financial resources. So think of the overall scale. India has 700,000 villages and 100,000 towns. I'm not talking of the cities. And connecting these villages and towns, imagine the amount of infrastructure that we have to build. And this building is a continuous process. And then, so building is fine, and building is also driven by several other considerations. But then how do we maintain a register of assets? And this is right now the biggest challenge. How do we have a management system for so much of infrastructure that we have invested in? So, and the second part is this: then how are we monitoring the assets that we have created? Which are the assets that are faring well? Which are the assets which are kind of degraded and need further investment? So unless we have a very strong register of assets and a credible register of assets and a very good monitoring system, it becomes quite a challenge looking after the infrastructure that we have created. There are 2-3 other issues which are extremely important. One, that these infrastructure assets are created at a much smaller scale. Unlike, you have large highways and airports and seaports. So when we are building smaller roads, we are not conducting risk assessments. Sometimes we think that this is not really a very cost-effective exercise. It's not worth its while. So risk assessment is often given a short shrift. And as a result, there are some issues that remain unaddressed. The issues that remain unaddressed: how do these assets cope with natural disasters? How do we address the problem of drainage? How do we address the problem of inundation? So we don't have a very credible system of risk assessment when it comes to the local level infrastructure. The second issue is the inadequate financial resources for maintenance. And that is the most important thing. You will find that a lot of infrastructure gets built, but over a period of time, they get degraded. And once they get degraded, they need to be restored to their original state, and it never happens. It happens once in a while when the resources are available. So there is no regular well-established regime of maintenance. Whenever there is a disaster, there is no systematic damage assessment. So that also is a huge problem. So we do not really take into account the kind of damages that have happened, the economic cost of those damages. And finally, the recovery and reconstruction. How do we rebuild those roads? Sometimes it's a problem getting resources for recovery and reconstruction. So while some of these things happen in case of large scale infrastructure, these things are not really a common feature for the asset class that lies with the local governments. So there are some basic issues that are there. Then finally, we have the issue of standards and codes. Do we have the standards and codes for these local level roads and bridges? And this is also an area that is very, very neglected. So we need to, in recent months, I have been working on this in terms of providing laying down the norms for recovery and reconstruction. Say for how much, for a road, how much of bitumen we should invest. What kind of material should we bring? What kind of compacting we should do? So these are very, very important issues for the durability of these assets. So standards and codes are extremely, extremely important, which have not really been developed. And maybe they have been developed in some part of the government, but they have not really been applied very well when you start doing it in remote corners of the country. So application of standards and codes is also a huge, huge challenge. So what is very important is that first, we need to have a good system for assessing risks, not for every asset, but for the asset class. That's important. Second is that we should have a well-established system of assessing damage and loss whenever something happens. And third, we should find some way of repairing, reconstructing, and strengthening these local level assets. So for that, local governments also need to be more resilient. They need to be more resourceful. They need to have more technical capacity, and they need to have more access to resources. So these are some of the important issues when you start looking at the local government's capacity to build and maintain infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vats. I think that's, just going from Italy, where national level monitoring and national level thinking about infrastructure, to a scale that is more community and local. I think it's really important as we start to think about resilience of infrastructure in terms of the code standards that may be applicable to larger infrastructure versus more nuanced, including capacities to actually do the monitoring, do the inspection, do the design, all of, it's a good, helpful way of thinking about infrastructure in two different ways. Let me move on to our speaker from Japan, Mr. Togo. Japan is in the forefront of DRR and building resilience of its infrastructure systems. Please share your country-specific experiences in building infrastructure resilience with a particular focus on risk assessment, policy frameworks, and financial arrangements that are in place. What would be some of your recommendations for G20 to foster the global efforts towards resilient infrastructure? Over to you.
Hello. First of all, I like to say something. So I believe that many people are in difficult situations due to the flooding in the Rio Grande do Sul. And I hope that everyone in the affected area can return to their normal lives as soon as possible. So first of all, to speak Japanese experience on resilient infrastructure, we have to touch the history of disaster management policy in Japan. And I will give you a briefing on that. So in 1959, a typhoon called Ise-1 hit Toka area, caused a large number of casualties and damage in infrastructure. So with the experience of this large disaster, 2 years later, the Basic Act on Disaster Management was enacted. Since then, Japan faced many large disasters, and every time we reflected and we amended the act based on the good best practices during in the time of disaster. So based on the act, various efforts have been made to build a disaster-resistant society in Japan. And in 2013, in response to disasters becoming more frequent and devastating, the Basic Act on National Land Resilience was enacted, aiming to build a socio-economic system with strength and flexibility. Under this law, efforts are being made to build disaster-resistant infrastructure. In 2014, the first basic plan for national land resilience passed through cabinet decision. The National Land Resilient Basic Plan is consistent of the basic policies to be implemented by each ministry and agency toward national land resilience. In 2020, the cabinet decided on the 5-year accelerating plan that constitutes measures requiring immediate implementation from 2021 to 2025. It is estimated that the total expenditure for this 5-year accelerated plan amounts up to 15 trillion yen. Most of the money will be spent on countermeasures against intensifying rainfall and projected large earthquakes in big cities like Tokyo. It covers river improvements to deal with increasing rainfall and seismic reinforcement of public facilities. Investing in hardware is important, but so is software. Out of the acceleration plan, capacity building efforts such as evacuation drills, rescue drills of medical teams are also supported by the national government. In terms of financial framework, in Japan, each ministry and agency plans its own policy in line with the philosophy of the National Resilience Act, and each ministry and agency applies for budgets based on that policy and implements the policy. I would like to mention 2 important points that I hope it contributes to G20. One is that investing in advance can reduce costs compared to investing after the disaster. Building resilient infrastructure can be very costly, but it is less expensive than making investments after the disaster. And best of all, it can save more lives in the event of the disaster. Secondly, I think the country should be the one to put effort into strengthening infrastructure. In Japan, to build a resilient infrastructure, a meeting headed by Prime Minister is held every year to check the progress of the basic plan for building resilient country. Thank you.
Thank you so much for highlighting the importance that the national leadership gives to this topic, including in its legal framework, including in the financial support to implement resilience, as well as softer measures like capacity building. Thank you again. I'm going to move to the other side of the world, to the US now. Ms. Keegan, clearly FEMA has extensive experience of implementing different types of mitigation programs like the BRIC, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program, and National Flood Insurance Program. We request you to share your country-specific reflections on the implementation of some of these mitigation programs that have contributed towards building infrastructure resilience. Also reflect how you have used risk assessments to design these programs. Over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you again for having us. We're really thrilled to be part of this conversation and to take learnings from around the world that we can take back here, and also to share out our experiences with programs like the Building Infrastructure in Resilient Communities. I wanted to just really start by saying this is a really historic time in the United States. Since day one, President Biden and Vice President Harris have made historic investments, not only in infrastructure, but in climate resilience. The focus around climate has both included a significant investment in energy and electrification in order to decarbonize our infrastructure and our investments, but also in resilient building. All of these investments are being presented through a lens of equity. The administration has made a historic commitment to equitable building and investment. And we know that in order to do this well, we require a whole of government perspective. So FEMA is one piece of this, but we work day in and day out with our interagency partners, both here at the federal level, but also in our state and local communities. FEMA does its work in many ways. It is a response and recovery agency, but for the last many years has recognized that in order to protect our communities better, we have to build in more resilient ways before disasters hit, and in our response and recovery efforts to build back better. This includes both preparing our communities, our state and local and tribal leaders in increasing their capacities and capabilities in resilient building, in response and recovery. I'll get to our assessment and how we're looking at that as well. And we also are one of the largest federal insurance agencies for disaster, especially around flood protection. But again, within our portfolio, we have infused resilience through each and every one of our components. And over the last many years, have been aligning all of our components' resilient efforts in order to build the area that I sit in, which is our resilience division. Our Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities program that you mentioned, the BRIC program, represents a really historic investment in building the right way in the beginning, to really be making these historic investments before a disaster strikes. This program started prior to this administration, but received a significant amount of investment in the Biden-Harris administration. What the program does is it allows communities to design and implement infrastructure investments that can range from everything from a gray infrastructure, stormwater investment, to nature-based solutions. And I'll share a couple of examples of that. After I mention, one of the things that was mentioned before by my colleagues was really the importance of codes and standards. One of the things that we've included in the BRIC program is an incentive for building codes. And we've received a great deal. Our communities love this incentive. They are really excited to be able to spend their funding on improving and upgrading and updating their building codes. And so we think that oftentimes funding helps, but sometimes incentivizing these efforts is a really good way of helping our communities to use their own tools to improve their own way of rebuilding and building. In addition to our BRIC program, we have our Flood Mitigation Assistance Program that you mentioned. This program has also received significant investment under our current administration. and has allowed communities to think differently about how they build along multiple fronts to improve flood mitigation. So that may include elevating homes, but it also includes incorporating nature-based solutions so that they can protect and prevent they can better control living with water within their communities. One of the things that we've been doing within our risk assessments in order to support these programs and to support all of the work that we are doing in protecting communities is to really look at all hazards, to not only look at the natural hazards, but to really incorporate an all hazards perspective. We've also been incorporating a look at future conditions, knowing that it doesn't serve us to only look at the past conditions, but to really be able to improve our risk modeling to look at future conditions. And again, as I mentioned, for the administration, FEMA has also made a strong commitment to incorporating equity into all of our risk assessments. One place that this has, one intersection place that this has come to fruition is in a program that we call the Community Disaster Resilience Zones. These are communities where we have taken a look at their risk profile, but also their social and economic vulnerability to develop a map for us across the nation of where we have the most vulnerable populations sitting in the areas of greatest risk. And this is allowing us to align resources within FEMA, within the whole of our federal government, but also paired with our local communities and our private sector. So both philanthropy as well as our private sector, to be able to address these conditions within communities, again, where we have the greatest risk and greatest vulnerability, to be able to turn the corner on these vulnerabilities. Finally, we also look at our co-benefits, really focusing on social, economic, and environmental co-benefits of each investment. Making sure that we are thinking about how we catalyze the utilization of small local businesses as well as local workforce in being able to do the rebuilding, the building of resilient infrastructure. I'll quickly turn, I know we're up against time, but I'll quickly turn to an example that maybe pulls all of this together. In New Orleans, Louisiana, in our southeast region, there's a program that is funded both by our BRIC program, or there's a portfolio that's funded both by our BRIC program, but also our colleagues at HUD through a different program called the National Resilience Disaster Competition. This program funds something called the Gentilly Resilience Water District. And this is a neighborhood in New Orleans that had significant flooding after Katrina, but really had a history of flooding even before Katrina. And it is a neighborhood that is diverse in its population, but has a significant set of pockets of low-income communities. And really the initiative is a broad initiative that pulls on the theme of living with water. And the investments include the development of a water resilience park that is a 20-acre plot of land that used to be owned by a convent within our Catholic diocese that was then gifted to the city in order to build a significant amount of water retention, so between detention and retention ponds, but then to become a living laboratory and a learning and educational center for how communities like Louisiana that are living in low-lying areas, a coastal community, can begin to think about better ways to live with water. Our Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities program is one of the main funders of this, as I mentioned, as is funding from HUD, but it's also been able to allow local funding and philanthropic funding to come in to help this community both store water, get it off the streets when we have heavy flooding, but also begin to help educate the community in really ways to live better with water. So I know we're up against time, so I'll turn it back to you, but I'm happy to answer any other questions. And thank you again.
So thank you, Ms. Keegan. I think there's a lot of case study material I'm hearing here. So I think I would really encourage some examples coming into the compendium. I think the whole notion of incentives, risk modeling that is also looking at future conditions, equity, how do you start to think about the most vulnerable population overlap with the most risky areas, as well as co-benefits. I think all of these resonate very well with the topic of resilient infrastructure. So I would like to encourage some good case study materials for the compendium to be shared beyond. I know we are running out of time, but I will, we have one more speaker. We will not have time to take question and answers from the audience and the other participants. What I would suggest is please post your questions in the chat group so that we can actually capture some of the interest that is getting developed by this session. Oscar, apologies that you're coming last and running out of the clock, but you are sitting in a very you're sitting in the bank in a financial organization which is now under more rising regulatory and commercial pressure to protect yourself from the impact of climate change and to align with global sustainability agendas. Banking regulators around the world are now formalizing new rules for climate risk management. We are getting a lot of interest on our side here as well on that. So how can we bring physical and climate risk assessment under mainstream compliance framework for financial sector entities and help accelerate private investment into resilience and adaptation initiatives for infrastructure? Over to you. I'm not going to cut short the time, so anybody who wants to drop off is most welcome, but we will stay on and listen in as well. So go, Oscar, over to you.
Thank you very much. No, my presentation will be very brief. First, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America and the Caribbean, for being part of this webinar. I have 4 messages. The first one is that we in financial institutions are learning how to deal with the complexity of how the landscape of risk is changing, is evolving, how new patterns of risk are happening and are taking place in all countries around Latin America, the Caribbean, where we work. And one of the messages that we are bringing to our shareholder countries is that we encourage an integrated approach between disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation. I think for the last probably 2 decades, we have been struggling how to we put a lot of effort trying to identify what makes different disaster reduction and climate adaptation, trying to separate both agendas. But in reality, we can believe that there are many things in common that the issues that we try we try to be very practical, and we try to say to ourselves, but also to our countries, that we need to find out common risk approach, whether if it is disaster risk or climate risk. We need to be proactive in how to understand risk and how we invest on reducing those risks, whether it comes from the disaster risk reduction agenda or from the climate agenda. An integrated approach will be for the benefit of the region. And having said that, is that thinking about the question that we were invited to address, compliance, we are also learning that we need to move beyond compliance. We have been compliant with environmental and social regulations since the creation of CAF. But right now, we have to think differently, because it's not that we have a strong environmental and social safeguards for all our financial operations. Is that now we need to be accountable for the money that we are investing in the region. And this is important because it's not just that we ask the countries that they need to put in front their national determined contribution to the Paris Agreement, and they also need to put together their action plans in the context of the Sendai framework for disaster reduction. This also applies to financial institutions, that we need to put together, to put in front what we are doing. What are we doing with the money that we are investing in the country? And we need to be accountable for that money. And this seems like a small change, but actually moving from compliance to accountability make us think that we need to be sure that the money that we are investing is actually really contributing to resilient development, to sustainable, green, inclusive, resilient development. And this leads to my second comment, is that what we are learning is that what we are asking the countries in terms of transparency, it also applies to us. We are asking the countries that they need to establish very strong mechanisms for monitoring, reporting, and verifying what they are doing in terms of a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of climate adaptations, in terms of disaster reduction. But actually, we also need to put strong mechanisms to monitor, report, and verify what is happening with the investment that institutions like CAP is doing. So these are two critical issues that when we start to put them together, make us think different. So the first one is that we are moving from compliance to accountability, and we are also acknowledging that the transparency principles that apply to countries also apply to us. And also, and one of the things that reflect that is that all the multilateral development banks, including CAF, are now aligning their operations to the Paris Agreement. So that means that we are thinking in advance how we establish a framework that make us be accountable for the investments of all our new operations, and how these new operations are aligned with the Paris Agreement. And this leads to my third and final comment, is that how this is reflected in investment in resilient infrastructure. The context, especially Latin America and the Caribbean, is very challenging because countries are facing strong financial restrictions, and we are very much aware of that. There is, in many countries, a high profile of public debt, and this is difficult to come to a country and ask them, well, you already have high public debt, but you need to invest more. So the challenge is not also for countries, not just demanding from our side that they need to invest more in order to make their existing infrastructure resilient, but also their new infrastructure to be resilient. But who is going to pay for that? And now the challenge that we are accepting is how we explore our existing financial instruments and how we develop new financial instruments that actually are designed with terms and conditions that sufficiently reflect principles of resilient infrastructure, but actually have a high level of concessionality. So that, and I think that's now the missing piece of the puzzle that we are trying to solve in CAP, the Development Bank of Latin America and the Caribbean, is how we design or how we put in front higher levels of concessionality in the investment that is linked to resilient infrastructure. So we know that in the short term, countries will have higher debt, higher public debt, but the return of the investment measured in terms of avoiding losses and damages, but also in terms of how they get more social benefits by investing in water and sanitation, education, transport, energy generation, etc., actually allows them to have social benefits. But also, if we include higher concessionality, they also have financial benefits. So that's where we are right now. Adding also to my initial comments that we are now being more accountable for the money that are put together. We are being more transparent on how our operations are aligned with the Paris Agreement. We are thinking that climate adaptation and disaster reduction needs to be seen as an integrated approach. And finally, is that we realize that financial needs more concessionality. And that's probably my 4 key messages for this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oscar. I think, the whole notion of DRR and climate change adaptation being 2 separate agendas, more and more we've been hearing, I think even under India's presidency last year, that these are not necessarily 2 separate agendas. And we do need to find ways of combining them. Even in our own research, we found that, the risk that we are carrying, 30% is related to things like earthquakes, landslides that have no climate aspect to them, but then 70% is actually related to climate. So thinking of disasters broadly, and within the context of that, what is climate change's effects to risks is something that we need to continue to build our thinking, build our nuanced understanding. And also, it'll be good to be, not today, but in a subsequent conversation, see how you're starting to monitor your investments from a DRR and adaptation perspective. I think there's a lot of understanding for the mitigation side. How do you look at greenhouse gas emission reduction? But on the adaptation side, I think we're still searching for sort of a good monitoring framework. So it'll be good to have a discussion on that subsequently as well. I will not summarize because I think all of these comments have been quite uniquely dispersed. There are some intersectionalities, but I think the dimensions on what the national government can do, how to look at community infrastructure, where codes and standards need to be differentiated. How do you bring in incentives? How do you bring in risk assessment that is now using the best science, being more probabilistic, not just looking at past science, understanding how finance is looking for more clarity on, how do you actually monitor investments from a point of view of disaster risk reduction and climate change. I think all of these are critically important. And for this working group, we'll put together a summary document from this discussion. That's why we'll also capture a lot of the chat groups. I do want to respect everybody's time. So I will actually first of all, thank you all for really participating. I think it's been a very, very rich discussion. Thank you all for also listening in. Do post comments to us in the chat group. And thank you also to the Brazilian presidency and UNDRR for jointly hosting this conversation. With that, I'm going to give it back to Abhilash to give some final comments. Thank you so much.
And in fact, I'll take the floor over from Abhilash. A big thanks to CDRI and to the Brazilian government for this excellent webinar. A big thanks to all the colleagues who participated. We have taken careful note of what you've mentioned, and like Amit said, we're looking at the chat, and we're definitely going to reflect this moving forward toward the working group meeting happening at the end of Brazil, 29-30. So a big thanks to you all, and looking forward to seeing you in Rio. Thank you.